delving into the depths of ancient Greek mythology and the little-known chapters of history that time has almost erased from memory, unveils a world brimming with astonishing events. These stories, as if carved in marble, unfolded amidst majestic temples on dusty paths and under the gentle glow of olive oil lamps, thousands of years ago, inviting us on a captivating journey through the centuries. Picture this scene. The day's clamour gradually subsides, twilight deepens, and the world around settles into tranquility. Perhaps the soft hum of a fan will create an atmosphere of serenity before we embark on our journey to ancient Greece, where gods walked the earth alongside mortals, and every stone seemed to hold a secret. Have you ever woken up with a headache so intense it felt like something was about to burst from your skull? Imagine Zeus, Lord of Olympus, experiencing a similar agony. However, in his case, something truly did burst forth, and that something was not merely a goddess, but one fully formed, clad in armour, wielding a spear, and possessing a mind that would soon become the sharpest on all of Mount Olympus. But before we dive deeper into this dramatic moment, it's worth stepping back a bit, for this story doesn't begin with Zeus's famous migraine, but with a prophecy that robbed him of his peace. It is known that Zeus was captivated by Metis, a titaness whose very name meant wisdom or cunning intelligence. She was not only extraordinarily beautiful, but also possessed the ability to outwit anyone, including Zeus himself, though he would never admit it. Try to imagine Metis. She wasn't one to spend her days idly lounging on clouds partaking in ambrosia. On the contrary, her mind was constantly at work, always contemplating, planning, staying several steps ahead of everyone else. While other gods argued and raised their voices, Metis calmly found solutions. She had a habit of tilting her head slightly when deep in thought, and her eyes would take on a distant look, as if she perceived possibilities that remained hidden to others. Zeus was utterly enchanted. In Metis, he saw someone who could match his power with her intellect, someone who could help him rule more wisely. They married, and for a time everything seemed perfect. Metis offered Zeus counsel in difficult decisions, helping him navigate the intricacies of divine governance. She possessed such a subtle art of suggesting ideas that Zeus genuinely believed they were his own thoughts. It was, without a doubt, quite ingenious. But then came the prophecy. In Greek myths, prophecies rarely brought good news and were almost always inescapable. This one proved particularly unsettling. It foretold that Metis would bear 2 children, first a daughter, who would be as wise as Zeus himself, and then a son, who would be even more powerful and would ultimately overthrow his father. Zeus already had bitter experience with this family tradition of overthrowing fathers. After all, he had done the same to his own father, Cronus, who, in turn, had done it to his father. It was like a deeply dysfunctional family tradition that Zeus desperately wished to discontinue. So Zeus acted in a way that seemed logical to him at the time, though in hindsight, it was a rather horrific act. He tricked Metis into transforming into a fly, and then he swallowed her whole, just like that. One moment she was there, offering wise counsel and gentle smiles, and the next, she was gone, dissolved within Zeus's divine essence. One might think the story would end there, But divine pregnancies unfold quite differently from those of mortals. Métis was already carrying her daughter when Zeus swallowed her, and this little future goddess continued to grow inside Zeus's head, quite literally within his skull. For several months, Zeus suffered from increasingly severe headaches. Imagine ruling the heavens and earth while feeling as if someone were pounding on your cranium from the inside. He tried everything: divine remedies, magical healing, even meditation, but nothing helped. The pain only intensified, becoming unbearable. The other gods began to notice changes in Zeus. He snapped at them during assemblies, lost his train of thought mid-sentence, and often stared into the distance, pressing his hands to his temples. Hera, his consort, was particularly concerned, though she likely suspected he had gotten himself into some new trouble. She was rarely wrong about such things. Finally, when the pain became utterly unbearable, Zeus summoned Hephaestus, the god of smithing and craftsmanship. Hephaestus was accustomed to unusual requests from his fellow gods, but this one was definitely strange, even by divine standards. "I need you to cleave my head open," Zeus commanded, probably not as calmly as it sounds. Hephaestus, being practical, asked the obvious questions. Why? How? Are you absolutely certain about this? But Zeus was beyond rational conversation at this point. The pressure in his skull felt as if it could split Mount Olympus itself. So Hephaestus, with the careful precision of a master craftsman, raised his axe. It was a beautiful weapon, perfectly balanced and sharp enough to cleave divine flesh. The other gods gathered to watch, likely keeping a safe distance in case the whole plan went horribly wrong. The axe descended with a sound like thunder cracking the sky, and from Zeus's head emerged Athena. However, dramatic retellings often omit an important detail. She didn't just appear and immediately begin dispensing strategic advice. For the first few moments she stood blinking in the bright Olympian light, probably as surprised as everyone else. Imagine being born fully grown. No childhood memories, no gradual learning, just sudden existence with a complete understanding of the world. She was in armor, yes, but it wasn't ornate or overly decorative. It was practical, well made, the kind chosen by someone who truly understood warfare. Her spear wasn't a ceremonial weapon, it was balanced for actual use. And her helmet, when she removed it, revealed hair already touched with the silver of wisdom, though she was entirely new to this world. The first thing she did was survey all the gods staring at her, then Zeus, who was rubbing his head with relief. She likely felt the lingering presence of her mother, Métis, somehow a part of her, which would take years to fully comprehend. Well, she might have said in that calm, measured voice that would become so familiar to heroes and supplicants throughout the ages, "This is interesting." Zeus, meanwhile, experienced the profoundest relief of his immortal life. The headache was gone, replaced by a strange sense of pride. Here was his daughter, clearly intelligent, obviously capable, and somehow he just knew she would never be a threat to his rule. On the contrary, she would become his greatest ally. And he was right. Athena became known as Zeus's favorite child, the one he trusted most. She never married, never had children who might threaten the established order. Instead, she became the goddess of wisdom, strategic warfare, and all crafts requiring both intellect and skill. But sometimes, in quiet moments between her duties, Athena would gently touch her temple, as if recalling something she had never truly experienced. Her mother Métis' wisdom lived within her, along with all those carefully thought out plans and quiet considerations that had been silenced too soon. What must it be like to be born with someone else's memories, with another's wisdom flowing through your mind like a gentle stream, to carry the love and knowledge of a parent you never truly met, but who was, in the most literal sense, a part of you? This question remains open, inviting contemplation on the depths of divine existence. The goddess we've just met, Athena, required temples built in her honor, and someone had to do the actual work of carving and setting those massive stones. While poets sang of heroes and gods, there were other hands, weathered, skilled, patient hands, that shaped the marble and limestone destined to stand for thousands of years. You've probably seen photographs of the Parthenon, that magnificent temple crowning the Athenian Acropolis. But have you ever considered the man who spent 3 years carving a single column capital, working with tools that would seem incredibly primitive today? His name might have been Carlos or Demetrius. We'll never know for sure, but his work outlasted empires. Let's call him Alexios, because every story needs a name, and imagine him waking before dawn on a cool morning in 440 BCE. The roosters are just beginning to crow in the city below the Acropolis, and the olive oil lamp in his small home flickers as he gathers his tools. Alexios had been a stonecutter for 23 years, learning the trade from his father, who in turn learned from his father. His hands were permanently stained with marble dust, and he had a small scar on his left thumb from where a chisel slipped when he was still an apprentice. He was 42 years old, making him experienced enough to work on the most important parts of the temple, but still strong enough to handle the physical demands. His morning meal was a modest affair: slices of bread rich with fragrant olive oil, a few ripe olives, and water diluted with light wine lay on the table. His wife, Penelope, routinely packed him a midday meal, another portion of bread, some cheese, and occasionally, if the season allowed, a handful of juicy figs. In the early hours of the morning she spoke few words. After 18 years of marriage, they had settled into a comfortable, established routine that required no abundance of speech or fuss. The walk up to the majestic Acropolis took him about 20 minutes, and Alexios wasn't the only one on this route. He joined a steady stream of labourers making the same ascent daily. Carpenters carefully clutching their tools hurried to their workstations. Artists with brushes and palettes full of pigments, and labourers whose lot it was to move massive marble blocks to their designated places, also ascended. They exchanged silent nods as their paths crossed. These people, united by a common purpose, were erecting something destined to outlive themselves, their descendants, and entire generations. By the time the sun began to rise over the eastern mountains, the construction site was already bustling with activity. The chief architect, Ictinus, as always, was poring over detailed blueprints from early morning, meticulously checking all calculations and measurements. His name was widely known, and it would undoubtedly be forever etched in the pages of future chronicles. However, Alexios possessed knowledge that history books would likely never record. Ictinus relied heavily on the invaluable practical experience of craftsmen like himself. Just the day before, Ictinus had called Alexios to inspect a difficulty with one of the column drums. An unforeseen vein ran through the marble, and the architect wanted to know if this might affect the strength and stability of the element. Alexios carefully ran his palms over the cold stone surface, his hands, having passed over thousands of marble blocks, could read the stone with the same certainty that others gleaned wisdom from ancient scrolls. "It will hold," he pronounced after a pause filled with deep consideration. "The stone's grain is aligned with the load, not against it. However, we will want to position this element so that the aforementioned vein is on the backside, hidden from the main line of sight." This was the kind of knowledge accumulated over decades of strenuous labor, the very wisdom born not from dusty scrolls or abstract mathematical equations, but from long years of direct interaction with stone, its careful study, and the understanding of its whims and boundless possibilities. That day, Alexios was dedicated to creating a section of the frieze that would encircle the temple's inner space. This artistic canvas depicted a solemn procession of Athenian citizens carrying offerings to the goddess Athena during the grand Panathenaic festival. His current section portrayed a group of youths leading cattle destined for sacrifice, a task he had been working on for 6 weeks. The work progressed with excruciating slowness. Every precise chisel strike was critical, for marble tolerates no mistakes. An overly forceful movement of the tool could cause a fragment to chip off that was meant to remain. An excessive caution would double the time required for work that could be completed much more efficiently. Alexios began each figure with roughing out the basic form, using a point chisel, a sturdy tool capable of removing significant volumes of stone relatively quickly. The monotonous tapping sound it emitted, thunk, thunk, after a while acquired an almost meditative quality, becoming a steady rhythm marking the passage of time. Other stonecutters working nearby created their own rhythmic patterns, and together they formed a kind of percussive ensemble whose sounds echoed among the marble columns. As the morning grew stronger and the sun climbed higher, Alexios switched to using more delicate tools. A flat chisel allowed him to carefully smooth surfaces and create clear, expressive lines. With calipers, he meticulously checked proportions, measuring the distance between a figure's eyes or the width of a bull's shoulders. The ancient Greeks had very strict ideas about ideal proportions, about the mathematical relationships meant to produce perfect beauty. However, Alexios deeply understood that mathematics alone could not create true art. There was something else, something more elusive, that distinguished merely good carving from a work of true beauty. He saw it in how his mentor, the venerable Sophron, could breathe life into marble, making it seem to breathe. Sophron had passed away 3 years ago, but his creations were everywhere in the temple, and Alexios would sometimes pause his work to carefully study a fragment carved by Sophron, trying to understand how the old master achieved such striking effects. Around noon, when the sun reached its zenith and the heat made the marble almost too hot to touch, the workers took a break. They gathered in any available shade, consuming their modest lunches and sharing water from large clay jars that were constantly replenished by young apprentices. Conversations during these short breaks rarely touched on art or architecture. More often, they discussed pressing, practical matters. For instance, whose wife was expecting a child, where to buy olive oil at the best price, or how serious the rumors about brewing problems with Sparta were to cause alarm. These people were not just masters of their craft. They were also citizens, husbands, fathers, and full members of their community. Alexios sat next to Nicias, a talented artist whose job was to create the temple's interior decoration. Nicias was significantly younger, about 28 years old, and still displayed such lively enthusiasm for every aspect of the grand project that Alexios found it both touching and a little tiring. "Have you seen the new batch of marble that arrived yesterday?" Nicias asked, biting into a piece of bread from Paros. "Its quality is extraordinary, so pure that in thin slices light almost shines through it." Alexios nodded. Of course he had seen it. Good marble for a stonecutter was the same as high-quality pigments for an artist, the foundation of all further creative work. Indeed, Parian marble was considered exceptional, possessing a unique crystalline structure that allowed light to penetrate slightly deeper than the surface, giving finished sculptures an almost radiant, living quality. "It's being saved for the cult statue," Alexios confirmed. "Phidias intends to use it for Athena's face and hands." This news was truly exciting. Phidias, the celebrated sculptor of all Hellas, was to create a statue of Athena that would be the central dominant element of the entire temple. The main part of the effigy would be made of gold and ivory, but the exposed skin, the face, hands, feet, would be carved from this precious Parian marble. After the break, Alexios returned to his section of the frieze. The afternoon work differed significantly from the morning routine. The changed light, now falling at a different angle, revealed aspects of the carving that had previously remained hidden. It was at this time that he could most clearly assess the progress, precisely determining where adjustments were needed. His attention was focused on the face of a youth in the procession, whose age was roughly comparable to that of his own son. He faced the task of creating a face that would look like a portrait of a specific person, someone one might encounter on the streets of Athens, and at the same time embody the ideal of youthful male beauty that the ancient Greeks valued above all else. The eyes presented a particularly complex challenge. Their gaze had to be alert and lively, focused on the sacred duty of the procession, yet not so individualized as to distract from the overall composition. Over his years of practice, Alexios had carved hundreds of eyes, and he had developed his own unique methods for creating the subtlest shadows and highlights that endowed the marble with the ability to seemingly see. As he worked, his thoughts turned to the idea of eternity. This temple was being built to stand forever, or at least for as long as human hands could make it. Long after Alexios was gone, long after everyone currently living in Athens had passed into oblivion and been forgotten, people would stand in this temple and gaze upon the work he was creating today. This thought was both sobering and inspiring. The face of the youth he was carving would outlast wars, political upheavals, the rise and fall of entire empires. In a way, Alexios was achieving a kind of immortality that no king or general could claim. His work would speak eloquently for him across the centuries. But within this grandeur also lay a deep humility. No one would know his name. No poet would compose songs of praise for Alexios, the simple stonecutter. His contribution would remain anonymous, dissolving into the grander glory of Athens and its patron goddess. And somehow this seemed right and natural to him. The temple was not a monument to personal glory. It was something far greater, something that inextricably linked all Athenians to their gods and to one another. Alexios was part of this unbreakable bond, just one link in a long chain stretching from the very foundation of the city to an unimaginable future. As the sun began to dip towards the western hills, casting long winding shadows across the majestic Acropolis, Alexios carefully cleaned his tools and prepared to head home. Tomorrow he would return to continue his slow, painstaking work of bringing stone to life. Day by day, fragment by fragment, he and his fellow craftsmen were creating something that would stand as an enduring testament to human skill and unwavering devotion. He was given to spend his days creating what he knew would outlast him by thousands of years. His work unfolded in quiet anonymity on a project so grand that it seemed to stretch into eternity itself. The craftsmen engaged in building Athena's temple usually worked up quite an appetite by lunchtime, and their meal invariably included the same precious golden ingredient into which Alexios dipped his morning bread. Olive oil in ancient Athens was not merely a foodstuff. It was the very lifeblood pulsing through the city's economy, culture, and daily rituals, much like blood flowing through veins. One can imagine Theodoros, an olive oil merchant who owned 3 extensive groves, sprawling across the slopes beyond Athens. He awoke before dawn, not so much out of excessive ambition, but because the specific nature of his business demanded it. Olive oil is a very delicate product, extremely sensitive to heat, light, and time, and this sensitivity could be the key factor determining the line between prosperity and destitution. The olive trees growing on Theodorus's land bore the mark of deep antiquity. Some of them had been carefully planted by his great-great-grandfather. These ancient giants were distinguished by their mighty, gnarled trunks and silvery green foliage that whispered softly with the slightest breeze. They did not reach great heights, for olive trees rarely do, but their strength was astonishing, as if they were made to withstand the scorching, arid summers and mild winters of Attica. Each tree possessed its own unique character, which revealed itself to those who knew how to recognize it. An old tree nestled by the stone fence invariably bore fruit that ripened a full week earlier than the rest. The grove located on the eastern slope yielded oil with a slight peppery note, which was particularly sought after by some clients. The trees growing by the stream produced a more abundant harvest, but their fruit had a milder flavor, ideal for cooking, though not as prized for special occasions when olive oil was used in sacred religious rites. This morning, Theodoros carefully oversees the harvest. It is late October, and the olives are almost perfectly ripe. They have taken on a dark purple, almost black hue, and their flesh yields slightly to a gentle squeeze, yet does not fall from the branches at the slightest touch. Timing is key in olive oil production. If harvested too early, less oil will be produced with a sharp, bitter taste. If delayed, the olives will begin to ferment on the tree, completely spoiling their flavor. His workers, a motley mix of slaves, hired free men, and neighbors helping in exchange for a share of the oil, have been harvesting for 3 days. They use long poles to gently knock the olives from the branches, allowing them to fall onto large pieces of cloth spread beneath each tree. This requires painstaking labor. Too strong a strike can damage next year's buds, while too gentle a touch will not dislodge the ripe olives. Observing this process, one might be surprised by how much conversation accompanies the harvest. Olive picking is not a solitary activity. It requires coordination between the person with the pole and those holding the cloth, and the rhythm of the work naturally creates opportunities for communication. People discuss everything: local politics, gossip from the agora, weather predictions, complaints about their various aches and ailments. One of the workers, an elderly man named Cleon, has been helping Theodoros with the harvest for 15 years. He knows these trees almost as well as their owner, and he has an opinion on everything related to olive cultivation. This new variety they're planting in Aegina, he says, shaking his head as he props a ladder against another tree. Too much oil, but not enough flavor. Quantity isn't everything. Theodoros nods distractedly. He has heard this opinion before, and while he doesn't entirely disagree, he also understands the economic pressures that drive agricultural innovation. Athens is growing rapidly, and the demand for olive oil seems to increase every year. Sometimes quantity does matter, especially when you're trying to feed an entire city. By mid-morning, they have filled several large baskets with fresh olives, and it is time to transport them to the olive press. This is where olive oil production becomes truly fascinating. However, most people never consider the complex process that transforms bitter, inedible olives into the golden oil that graces their tables. The olive press is an imposing piece of equipment, a large stone wheel that can be rolled over the olives to crush them into a thick paste. The wheel is turned by a mule, walking in circles hour after hour, with periodic breaks for water and rest. It is not the most glamorous job, but it requires attention. The olives must be thoroughly crushed, but not so aggressively that the pits are broken, which would add an undesirable bitterness to the oil. Once the olives are thoroughly crushed, the paste is spread onto round mats woven from plant fibers. These mats are then stacked and placed under a large wooden beam, which acts as a lever press. Weights are added to one end of the beam, creating immense pressure that gradually squeezes the oil from the olive paste. The first oil that emerges is the most valuable, clear, golden, with a fresh, fruity aroma that speaks of sunshine and careful cultivation. This first pressing, which we might today call extra virgin olive oil, is in highest demand at the agora. Wealthy Athenians use it for exquisite dishes, and it is indispensable for religious ceremonies where purity is paramount. However, the process does not end there. After the first pressing, the mats are rearranged and pressed again, yielding a second-grade oil that is still perfectly suitable for most culinary purposes. Even after this, the remaining paste can be mixed with hot water and pressed once more, producing a lower-grade oil suitable for lamps and other non-culinary needs. Theodoros prides himself on wasting nothing on his farm. The remaining pulp and pits make excellent fertilizer for the next year's crop. The water used in the final pressing, though not potable, can be used to irrigate the olive trees during dry spells. Even the mats, when they finally wear out, are composted and returned to the soil. This afternoon he will load amphorae, those distinctive clay vessels with narrow necks and pointed bottoms, with his best oil and take them to Athens for sale. The amphorae themselves are works of art, made by skilled potters who understand that the vessel is almost as important as its contents. A well-made amphora protects the oil from light and air, keeping it fresh for months or even years. The journey to the city takes about 2 hours by ox-cart, along a road that has been smoothed by generations of similar trips. Theodoros knows every stone and rut on the path, every place where the cart might get stuck in wet weather, every vista that opens up to a panorama of the city and its surroundings. As he approaches Athens, traffic increases. Other farmers bring their produce to market: wheat, barley, wine, honey, cheese, vegetables. The city depends on this daily influx of food from the surrounding countryside, and the farmers depend on the city's demand for their products. It's a relationship that works because both sides need what the other offers. Theodoros's usual spot in the agora is near the southwest corner, where he has been selling oil for 12 years. His customers know where to find him, and he knows their preferences. Aristophanes, the cook, always wants the peppery oil from the eastern grove. The priestess of Demeter insists on oil from the oldest trees, claiming she can taste the difference in ritual preparations. But today he has a new customer, a young woman who seems unsure of what she's looking for. She's probably recently married and still learning to manage a household. Theodoros takes the time to explain the different grades of oil, letting her sample small amounts from his finger. For cooking fish, he says, you want something with a bit of a bite, something that won't disappear under stronger flavors. But for bread, or for drizzling over vegetables, you might prefer something softer, more subtle. Such instruction is part of his job, and he enjoys it. There is satisfaction in helping someone understand something you know well, in sharing knowledge that has been passed down through generations of olive growers and oil makers. By the end of the day, most of his amphorae are empty, sold to buyers who will carry the oil home in smaller containers. The money earned will go towards what his farm cannot produce: salt, iron, tools, pottery, cloth. It will also provide a small surplus that will allow him to gradually improve his groves, planting new trees to replace those that have finally grown old and ceased to yield good fruit. As he loads the empty vessels back onto the cart for the return journey, Theodoros reflects on the strange wonder of his existence. These ancient trees, planted by ancestors he never knew, continue to provide sustenance for families he will never meet. The oil flowing from his presses will light lamps in homes throughout Athens, nourish children yet to be born, anoint athletes preparing for competitions, and serve as offerings in temples dedicated to gods whose stories stretch back to the beginning of time. There is something deeply satisfying about participating in this ancient cycle. Planting, tending, harvesting, processing, selling, then starting all over again. The olive trees will outlive him, as they outlived his father and grandfather. The knowledge of how to turn bitter fruit into golden oil will pass to his sons and their sons after them. What do you think it is like to work with something so deeply rooted in the earth and in human tradition, where daily labor connects you to thousands of years of accumulated wisdom? The olive oil Theodoros just sold will eventually make its way to many tables across Athens, including the one where Philippos, a hoplite in the Athenian army, shares his evening meal with his family. But right now, as dawn breaks over the mountains, Philippos is 40 miles from home, carrying 60 pounds of gear and wondering if his feet will ever stop hurting. The poet's tales praising hoplites paint pictures of valiant warriors standing shoulder to shoulder, their bronze armor gleaming in the sun, their hearts burning with a thirst for Athenian glory. However, the true reality of military service differs significantly from these elevated images. Much of a hoplite's time is spent on grueling marches, and Philippos has covered a considerable distance lately. His unit left Athens 6 days ago, responding to alarming news of raiders threatening one of the city's allied settlements. As it turned out, the alarm was false. The supposed raiders were merely a group of shepherds who had wandered further than usual while following their flocks. But orders are orders, and the army does not retreat simply because the threat proved illusory. The warriors continued their march to a border fort, where they were to spend 2 weeks restoring fortifications and training the local militia. Philippus was 31 years old, placing him among the middle-aged members of his unit. He had served as a hoplite for 13 years. Since he inherited enough land to acquire the necessary equipment in Athens, Military service had been both a duty and a privilege for him. Only sufficiently wealthy citizens, capable of purchasing their own armor and weapons, were eligible to serve in the heavy infantry. His panoply, a full set of hoplite gear, represented a significant investment. The bronze cuirass alone cost more than a skilled craftsman earned in 3 months. The round shield, or hoplon, which gave the hoplites their name, was made of wood covered with bronze, and featured a distinctive rim that could serve as a weapon in close combat. The 9-foot spear was perfectly balanced for thrusting, not throwing. A short sword served as a backup weapon, and a bronze helmet with a distinctive crest completed this warrior's ensemble. All this equipment was strapped to Philippus's body, or slung over his shoulders as he walked along the dusty road. The weight was distributed as evenly as possible, but after 6 days of marching, every strap had found a way to chafe his skin, and every piece of metal seemed to have developed its own method of digging into his flesh. The morning was still cool, which was a true blessing. By midday, when the sun reached its zenith, the bronze armor would become almost unbearably hot. Philippus had long since learned to drink water regularly throughout the day, even when not particularly thirsty, for dehydration in armor could be extremely dangerous. He marched alongside Nicodemus, a potter who served in the same unit. For years they had walked together on various campaigns, and an easy, natural conversation had developed between them, helping to pass the long hours on the road. "My wife," Nicodemus said, adjusting his shield strap for the 100th time this morning, "thinks I should ask for a garrison assignment in the city. It's easier for the family, she says. A more predictable schedule." Philippus considered these words. Garrison duty had its advantages. Most nights one could sleep in one's own bed. One could attend to personal affairs. Children grew up knowing who you were, but such service also tended to be incredibly boring. Standing guard at the city gates, escorting officials to meetings, maintaining equipment that was rarely used in actual combat. "The pay is about the same," Philippus pointed out, "but you miss out on your share of any spoils we might capture." This was an important consideration for citizen soldiers who were not wealthy. Military service was paid, but not generously, and the prospect of additional income from successful campaigns could significantly impact a family's economic situation. The column of marching hoplites stretched for almost a quarter of a mile along the road. Approximately 400 men were on this expedition, organized into units by their tribes and demes. Philippus belonged to the Antiochus tribe, and within it he was part of a group from his local deme, Achane. These were people he had known most of his life, neighbors, relatives, those he regularly encountered in the agora or at religious festivals. This familiarity was both a strength and a complication. On one hand, hoplite warfare depended on mutual trust and coordination. When a man stood in the phalanx, his life literally depended on whether his neighbor held his position and did his job. It was reassuring to know that the man holding the shield protecting your right side was someone you had grown up with, whose nature you understood. On the other hand, personal relationships could complicate military discipline. The man marching in front of Philippus was his cousin Demetrius, who had a tendency to complain loudly about everything from the quality of their rations to the competence of their officers. In civilian life, this was simply part of Demetrius's personality, something his family tolerated with good-natured eye rolls. In military situations, however, it could be genuinely disruptive to morale. Around mid-morning, the column reached a small stream, where they were allowed a short rest. The men shed their heavy packs and immediately headed for the water, not only to drink, but also to splash their hot faces and necks. Some of the younger soldiers completely removed their bronze cuirasses, but veterans like Philippus knew that the effort to re-don the armor was not worth the temporary relief. Instead, he found a shady spot under an olive tree and carefully sat down, mindful of the sword at his hip and the spear he leaned against the trunk. From his pack, he took out a piece of stale bread and a few dried figs, standard campaign rations, nutritious if not particularly exciting. As he ate, Philippus watched the young men splashing in the stream and remembered his first campaign 15 years ago. He had been so eager to prove himself, so convinced that military service would be all glory and heroism, that the reality of sore feet, heavy gear, and endless walking had come as a significant shock. But over the years, he had come to appreciate military service in a different way. There was something about the straightforwardness of army life. You knew what was expected of you. Your duties were clearly defined. Success and failure were usually obvious. In civilian life, Philippus farmed the land left to him by his father, growing olives and barley and keeping a few goats. It was good, honest work, but it was also full of uncertainties. Weather, crop diseases, fluctuating market prices, the need to maintain good relations with neighbors who might help in emergencies. All these factors could affect his family's well-being in ways largely beyond his control. Military service, by contrast, simplified his life. Follow orders, maintain your gear, look out for your fellow soldiers, do your duty when called to battle. There was something almost reassuring in that clarity. The rest period ended too soon, as it always does, and the column reformed to continue the march. The road ahead gradually climbed into hills covered with scrub oak and wild herbs. The landscape was beautiful in its own way, rocky, sun-baked, dotted with small farms and shepherds' huts, but Philippus had learned to see it primarily from a tactical perspective. This ridge would provide good cover for archers. The narrow pass ahead could be easily blocked by a small force, trapping a larger army in the valley below. The flat ground near this village would be suitable for forming a phalanx, but the rocky terrain to the east would favor lighter, more mobile troops. This way of seeing the landscape gradually developed in experienced soldiers. Everything became a potential battlefield, every natural feature a possible advantage or impediment. It was not a particularly peaceful way to see the world, but it was practical knowledge that had saved Philippus's life in several real battles. By the end of the day, the fort they were heading for became visible in the distance. A modest cluster of stone buildings surrounded by walls that looked as if they had seen better days. This was what they were to repair for the next 2 weeks, along with training the local militia in basic tactics and formations. It was not glamorous work, but it was important. The network of small forts and allied settlements surrounding Athens was part of what kept the city safe and prosperous. Each outpost extended Athenian influence a little further, served as a base for patrols that kept trade routes secure, and offered refuge to farmers and shepherds when raiders appeared. As they approached the fort, Philippus saw people coming out to meet them. The garrison commander, local officials, children who were excited by the arrival of real Athenian soldiers. There would be a short ceremony, a few speeches about duty and service to the city, and then the practical work of setting up camp and beginning their assigned tasks. This evening, he would sleep on the ground under the stars, wrapped in his cloak and using his shield as a pillow. It was uncomfortable but familiar. and there was something to be said for the simple pleasure of finally removing his armor and resting his feet. Tomorrow he would wake up with new aches and begin the work of strengthening this small outpost of Athenian power. It was not the stuff of epic poetry, but it was the kind of constant, unglamorous effort that actually keeps a city-state functioning and secure. What must it be like to carry such a burden, both literally and figuratively, the physical weight of armor and weapons, and the responsibility of protecting not only your own family, but the entire community that depends on your service? While Philippos and his fellow soldiers marched to the border fort, pilgrims from all corners of the Greek world embarked on their own, no less significant journey. Their path led to Delphi, a place far more famous and shrouded in mystery, where the oracle was believed to utter the words of Apollo himself. However, behind the spectacular prophecies and sacred rituals lay a less visible, yet no less important story. The story of daily life unfolding in the shadow of powerful gods. Allow me to introduce Pythia. This, of course, isn't her real name, which was probably something quite ordinary, like Cleonia or Theodora, but the honorary title she adopted upon becoming the living voice of the oracle. She is 43 years old, and for 11 years she has borne the burden of this sacred service. Right now, she is in her modest room within the temple complex, preparing for what may be the most important consultation of her career. Tomorrow, ambassadors from Athens are expected, whose questions concern a planned military campaign. The next day, a delegation from Sparta seeks divine guidance on a contentious issue of succession. And the following week, a wealthy merchant from Corinth will arrive to inquire whether Apollo approves of his plan to found a new trading colony. The stream of questions never ceases, and each carries the weight of decisions capable of affecting the fates of thousands of people. But tonight, in this quiet hour before dawn, Pythia is simply a middle-aged woman with faintly greying hair and tired eyes, mentally and spiritually preparing for another day when she must become the voice of a god. Her routine begins with purification rituals that remain unseen by most visitors to Delphi. She bathes in the sacred Castalian spring, whose water is so icy that even in summer it elicits an involuntary gasp from her. This sharp cold is an essential part of the preparation. It is meant to cleanse her mind and ensure her full presence in her body, making her ready for any divine inspiration that may descend. After bathing, she dons a simple white chiton, symbolizing her sacred service. No ornaments, no embellishments, nothing should distract from her role as a pure conduit for Apollo's wisdom. Her breakfast is equally ascetic. Bread, water, perhaps a few almonds. She learned long ago that prophecies come easier on an almost empty stomach. The oracle chamber itself is a place unlike any other on earth. It is built over a natural fissure in the rock and permeated with the scent of laurel leaves, mixed with a subtle, sweetish smell of gases seeping from deep within the earth. Modern scientists propose various theories regarding the nature of these gases, perhaps ethylene or other natural chemical compounds capable of inducing altered states of consciousness. However, Pythia does not think in terms of chemistry. For her, the strange sensations she experiences in the chamber are nothing less than the unseen presence of the god himself. Her assistant, Nicomachus, is already awaiting her arrival at the temple. He is a priest who has served at Delphi for 23 years, and his role is to be the interpreter between the oracle and the outside world. Pythia utters the words Apollo grants her, but these words are not always clothed in forms easily understood by ordinary people. Sometimes she speaks in verse, sometimes in riddles, and sometimes in languages she does not consciously know. Nicomachus has, over the years, developed considerable skill in translating divine pronouncements into practical and accessible advice. It is delicate work. He must remain faithful to the oracle's words while making them comprehensible to people who have travelled hundreds of miles and spent considerable sums for the privilege of consulting Apollo. The Athenian delegation arrived late last night, he informs her, as they walk through the temple corridors. 3 generals and a representative from the assembly. They are inquiring about the proposed expedition to Sicily. Pythia nods. She had anticipated this consultation. The proposed Sicilian expedition is a subject of lively discussion throughout the Greek world. It is an ambitious plan that could bring great glory and wealth to Athens, or turn into a complete disaster. Such a decision, which mortal leaders prefer not to make without divine guidance. The consultation chamber is already prepared for their arrival. The sacred tripod, a 3-legged bronze stool, stands elevated over the fissure in the rock. Laurel branches, sacred to Apollo, are arranged throughout the room. The eternal flame burns steadily in its bronze brazier, as it has for centuries. Pythia sits on the tripod and closes her eyes, allowing her breathing to slow and deepen. This is the most mysterious part of her service, the moment when she must somehow open herself to become a vessel for divine communication. After 11 years of practice, she has developed methods that help, but the process is never exactly the same. Sometimes inspiration comes as words that seem to form in her mind without her conscious involvement. Sometimes it is more like images or emotions that she must somehow translate into human language. And sometimes, more often than she would like to admit, nothing happens at all, and she must sit in silence until Apollo chooses to speak, or until it becomes clear that today is not a day for prophecy. The Athenian delegation is led by Nicus, a general whom she remembers from previous consultations. He is a cautious, devout man who rarely makes important decisions without divine guidance. His questions are always thoughtful, and he listens respectfully to any answers he receives. But today there is something different in his demeanour, a tension that suggests he already fears what the oracle might tell him. When Nicomachus presents the formal question about the Sicilian expedition, Pythia senses that Nicias hopes for a clear negative answer. Permission to abandon a plan he considers dangerous. The inspiration, when it comes, is unusually clear and immediate. Words form in Pythia's mind, words she utters aloud, not fully understanding their meaning. The expedition will bring great changes to Athens. Many will sail who will not return. The gods favour those who act justly, but justice and victory are not always the same. This is the type of answer that seekers of the oracle both love and hate. It clearly pertains to their question, yet is open to multiple interpretations. Does it mean the expedition is favoured by the gods, or is it a warning against it? The ambiguity is frustrating, but it is also honest. The future is rarely as clear as people would like it to be. Nicomachus carefully records the oracle's words, and the Athenian delegation withdraws to discuss their meaning. This is another aspect of consulting the oracle that visitors do not always anticipate. The interpretation of a prophecy can be as important as the prophecy itself. Between consultations, Pythia rests in a small garden behind the temple. It is a peaceful place, shaded by ancient olive trees and filled with the hum of bees diligently working among the lavender and rosemary. These quiet moments are vital for maintaining her mental balance in a job that requires her to be constantly available to the divine. She has been Pythia long enough to see the consequences of some of her prophecies. Cities went to war or refrained from war based on her words. Individuals made life-altering decisions thanks to the guidance received in the oracle chamber. The weight of this responsibility can sometimes be overwhelming. But there are also moments of genuine wonder, when she feels distinctly connected to something far greater than herself. Not every prophecy comes with dramatic inspiration. Many consultations involve simple requests for guidance on everyday problems, and the answers that come through her often prove surprisingly practical and helpful. A farmer wants to know the best time to plant his crops. A woman asks if she should accept a marriage proposal. A merchant inquires about the safest route for a trading journey. These are not the consultations that make history, but they are the ones that remind Pythia that her role is ultimately to help people live more wisely. As the day draws to a close, she receives visitors from Thebes, Corinth, and a small city-state in southern Italy. Each consultation follows the same pattern: formal presentation of the question, a period of inspired response, careful recording of her words, discussion of meaning and interpretation. But behind this ritual structure, a more human drama unfolds. These are people facing genuine uncertainty, seeking guidance in situations where the stakes are often very high. Pythia has learned to listen not only to their formal questions, but also to the fears and hopes that underlie those questions. A young man from Corinth, for instance, asks about a business venture, but his true concern is whether he is worthy of his father's respect. An elderly woman from Thebes inquires about her grandson's education, but what she really wants to know is whether her lineage will continue to flourish after she is gone. By evening, when the last consultation is complete, and the temple complex settles into silence, Pythia is exhausted with a fatigue that has nothing to do with physical exertion. Speaking for a god, even for just a few hours a day, requires a kind of emotional and spiritual energy that is difficult to describe to people who have not experienced it. She eats a simple dinner alone in her quarters: bread, cheese, olives, water mixed with a small amount of wine. The food tastes especially good after a day of fasting and spiritual effort. As she eats, she hears the distant sound of pilgrims gathering around their campfires, discussing the guidance they received and making plans for their journey home. Tomorrow, new questions will come, new seekers, new opportunities to serve as a bridge between the human and divine worlds. The work will continue, as it has for centuries, as long as people need guidance and Apollo chooses to provide it through mortal voices. What must it be like to spend your days translating the whispers of the gods into words that ordinary people could understand and use? To bear such responsibility for other people's most important decisions? Quiet morning on the Thessalian plain. The pilgrims gathering around their flickering campfires in Delphi in the pre-dawn quiet will be hungry tomorrow morning. Their essential breakfast will depend directly on the tireless labor of people like Dionysius, a farmer whose cultivated fields stretch across the fertile Thessalian plain, far from the glitter of famous temples and the bustle of lively agoras that so often capture our attention when we mentally transport ourselves to the era of ancient Greece. Dionysius cultivates wheat and barley on land his family has carefully farmed for 6 generations. He is 54 years old, and his hands bear the permanent imprint of dark soil and scorching sun. He possesses knowledge of weather conditions and soil health that cannot be gleaned from books. It is wisdom passed down through generations and honed by personal experience. Right now, on this cool spring morning, he walks leisurely through his fields with the focused attention characteristic of a man whose survival, as well as the well-being of his family, depends on making absolutely correct decisions. When to sow, how much to sow, and precisely where to place the crops. This year's winter was unusually mild, which is generally considered a favorable sign for agriculture. However, Dionysius has learned to be wary of hasty conclusions. A mild winter, while it may herald an early spring, which sounds very positive, also carries a danger. Some pests that usually perish in severe frosts may survive. An early planting, despite potentially yielding a larger harvest, carries an increased risk of crop damage if late frosts unexpectedly arrive after the seeds have already sprouted. He stops at the edge of his largest field, squats down, and scoops up a handful of earth. This movement is almost unconscious. He checks the soil with his fingers, looking for that proper balance of moisture and texture that indicates optimal planting condition. Soil that is too wet will cause seeds to rot before they can sprout. Too dry and they won't sprout at all. The soil today seems suitable, though not ideal. Ideal soil is more a matter of hope than reality, but it is quite adequate for the work ahead. Dionysius straightens up and calls to his son Callisthenes, who is preparing the ox-drawn plough at the far end of the field. Callisthenes is 22. He is robust from years of farm work and eager to take on more responsibility for family affairs. However, he is young enough to sometimes question old ways of working, which sparks interesting conversations during the long hours they spend together. "Father," Callisthenes says, guiding the plough into position, "I was talking to Aristodemus yesterday. He plans to try a new planting scheme we heard about from the Egyptians. Denser planting, more intensive cultivation. He thinks it could increase yields by up to 20%. Dionysius thoughtfully considers the suggestion, checking the plough's bronze share, ensuring it is properly sharpened and securely fastened. He has heard of Egyptian methods and they do sound promising in theory. However, theory and practice are two entirely different things, especially when dealing with something as unpredictable as agriculture. Aristodemus has good land, he finally pronounces. Rich soil, a reliable water source, enough slaves to do the extra work that intensive cultivation requires. Our situation is different. This is an inherent part of the continuous learning that every farmer must pass on to the next generation. It's not just about the technical knowledge of how to grow crops, but the wisdom to understand what will and won't work in their specific circumstances. Every farm is unique, shaped by a distinct combination of soil, climate, water availability, labor, and market condition. They begin ploughing, following the furrows that stretch the length of the field. The work is rhythmic, almost meditative, once you get into its tempo. The ox knows what to do and rarely needs guidance. Callisthenes walks beside the animal, occasionally adjusting its direction to keep the furrows straight and even. Dionysius follows behind, using a short hoe to break up large clumps of earth and level the bottom of the furrow. As they toil, Dionysius automatically, with the vigilance of a man whose livelihood depends directly on the vagaries of the weather, observes the sky. The clouds today are high and thin, which likely means no rain. This is good for ploughing, but implies they will have to carefully monitor soil moisture over the next few days. Too many clear days in a row, and the ground will become too hard for planting. The rhythm of work naturally creates opportunities for conversations, and father and son discuss many things as they progress across the field. Family news: Callisthenes' younger sister is getting married next month, and preparations need to be made. Local politics: the city assembly is debating a new tax on grain exports, which could affect their income. Technical farming questions: whether to expand the area devoted to wheat or plant more barley instead. Each of these conversations reflects the complex web of relationships and considerations that shape a farmer's life. Marriage requires careful planning because harvest season is approaching, and they will need all available labor during those critical weeks. The tax discussion is important because Dionysius sells a portion of his crop to merchants who export grain to other cities. The choice between wheat and barley involves balancing market prices, soil conditions, water needs, and family preferences. By midday, they have ploughed approximately half the field. This is good progress, but the work is not yet complete. They rest in the shade of an old oak at the edge of the field, sharing bread, cheese, and water from a clay jug that Callisthenes' mother packed for them this morning. As they eat, Dionysius points out landmarks and features of their land that eloquently narrate the story of many years of careful cultivation. "See that small rise?" he asks. "The drainage is better in that part, so we always plant our earliest wheat there. And that low-lying section by the stream? It stays wet longer, making it ideal for barley." This deep, intuitive knowledge of the land is formed by decades of painstaking labor. Every slope, every drainage pattern, every subtle change in soil quality, all constitute invaluable information that influences planting decisions. A good farmer learns to read his land, much as a scholar reads ancient scrolls, discerning patterns and possibilities that remain invisible to outsiders. Afternoon, the weather begins to shift. Clouds gather from the west, hinting at possible rain later. This creates a slight dilemma. Rain would be beneficial for the soil, softening it and making work easier. However, rain would also delay planting, and the window for optimal spring planting is already closing. Dionysius decides to finish ploughing this field today, even if it means working a little longer than usual. This is the kind of decision farmers make dozens of times a season, balancing many factors, trying to optimize results while acknowledging that much of what happens is beyond their control. As they resume work, Callisthenes asks a question that young men have probably asked their farmer parents for millennia. "Do you think I should stay on the farm, or try something else? Maybe move to the city, learn a craft?" It's a fair question, for farming is hard work with uncertain rewards. City life offers different opportunities: specialization in crafts, trade, participation in politics, cultural events, and there's no guarantee that the family farm can sustain another generation at the same standard of living that Dionysius has been able to maintain. But there is also something special about a farmer's life: the satisfaction of growing food that feeds people, the deep connection to the land, the seasons, and the cycles of nature, the independence that comes from producing most of what your family needs to survive. "The city needs what we grow here," Dionysius says, after a moment's thought, "and we need what the city produces: tools, pottery, cloth, bronze. Neither way of life makes sense without the other." This isn't quite a direct answer to Callisthenes' question, but it's a perspective worth considering. The relationship between rural and urban life isn't adversarial, it's complementary. The grain Dionysius grows will feed the craftsmen who make the tools he uses. The taxes he pays will support the soldiers who protect his land. The surplus he sells will go to purchase manufactured goods that make his family's life more comfortable. By evening, the field is fully ploughed and ready for planting. Tomorrow, if the weather is favourable, they will begin the painstaking work of sowing the seeds, walking up and down the furrows, scattering grain by hand at a rate calculated for maximum germination and yield. As they clean and put away their tools, Dionysius reflects on another successful day of preparing for another harvest. The work never ends. There is always something that needs attention, some aspect of the farming operation that can be improved, some new challenge to address. But there is also a deep satisfaction in this ancient partnership between human effort and natural abundance. The wheat and barley that will grow in this field will become bread in cities throughout the Greek world. They will sustain families, communities, provide for a complex civilization that produces art, philosophy, and drama. It all begins here, with the soil and the seeds and the patient labor of people who understand how to draw sustenance from the earth. The grain harvested from Dionysius's fertile fields was eventually destined to leave the borders of Greece, embarking on distant voyages aboard ships propelled by men like Lysander. For 4 years, this robust man had dedicated his strength to the Athenian navy, tirelessly working an oar, and now, at dawn on another serene morning in the Aegean Sea, he takes his place among 170 rowers, seated on wooden benches aboard a trireme, patiently awaiting the signal that will mark the beginning of another day of grueling training. Lysander was 26 years old, and his journey began in a humble fishing village nestled on the coast of Attica. His decision to join the fleet was not driven by an ardent desire for adventure or a yearning for martial glory. The reality was far more prosaic. Naval service promised better remuneration than a fisherman's meagre catch, and offered career prospects that simply didn't exist in his native home. Nevertheless, naval life proved surprisingly engaging, though it demanded incomparably greater effort and dedication than he could have imagined. The ship to which he dedicated his years, the Millennia, was a true triumph of engineering and shipbuilding. At 120 feet in length, this vessel was designed for maximum speed and exceptional maneuverability, not for carrying heavy cargo. Its hull, sleek and narrow, was skillfully crafted to cut through the water efficiently, utilizing the synchronized efforts of all its numerous oars. Above the rower's deck was space for marines and officers, where their weapons and equipment were stored. But the true heart of the ship beat here, in the rowing compartment, where men like Lysander generated the vital force that made everything else possible. Lysander's position was on the middle level among the rowers. It wasn't the most prestigious assignment, but neither was it the most difficult. The top-level rowers, known as thranites, received slightly higher pay, as their oars were longer and required more skill to manage. At the same time, the bottom-level rowers, called thalamites, worked in more cramped conditions and constantly faced occasional splashes of seawater when the ship gained high speed. Lysander's oar, about 13 feet long, had a blade that was carefully carved and perfectly balanced to ensure maximum efficiency. After 4 years of daily training, he had perfectly mastered how it should feel in his hands. The distribution of weight, the resistance encountered when submerged in water, and the subtle vibrations that unmistakably told him whether he was rowing in perfect synchronization with the rest of the crew. The man next to him was Proclus, a Navy veteran with 7 years of service, who had become a kind of mentor to the younger rowers. Proclus had experience in actual battles, fighting against Spartan ships during border conflicts. His stories gave the rest of the crew the most vivid and realistic idea of what naval warfare was truly like. What people usually don't understand about naval combat, Proclus remarked yesterday during their short break, is how much it depends on rowing. All the weapons in the world won't do any good if you can't maneuver your ship into the right position, and that positioning depends entirely on us. It was this understanding that gradually came to Lysander during his service in the Navy. From the outside, a trireme might seem like a warship that happened to be propelled by oars, but from the inside, it was much more accurate to consider it a high-precision rowing machine that again happened to carry weapons. All other elements, the bronze ram at the bow, the marines with their spears and shields, the tactical genius of the officers, became significant only if the rowers could put the ship exactly where it needed to be, at precisely the right moment. The morning drills involved practicing complex maneuvers that made trireme warfare so demanding and unpredictable. The crew would perfect the deep plows, a tactic where the ship aims to break through the enemy formation and ram it from the flank. They would practice the periplus, a flanking maneuver requiring impeccable coordination between multiple vessels. And of course they would hone the basic yet crucial skill of quickly moving backward to avoid deadly ramming attacks from enemy ships. The Caleusts, an experienced rowing master responsible for maintaining rhythm and giving commands, signaled the start. Oars, his command rang out, and 170 oar blades simultaneously cut through the water. The sound was distinct and incomparable, impossible to fully get used to. It was the splash of blades entering the water, the creak of oar handles rubbing against leather thole pins, and the rhythmic groan of the rowers' efforts. "Ready, pull," followed the next command, and then the vessel moved. The ship smoothly gained speed as all these individual efforts merged into a single, powerful forward motion. Lysander felt the familiar burning in his shoulders and back as he fully entered the rhythm. Rowing a trireme was significantly different from paddling a small boat. The resistance was enormous, and maintaining combat speed required tireless effort from every man on board. However, there was also something deeply satisfying about this work. When everything went perfectly, when all the rowers acted in flawless synchronization, the ship seemed to glide across the water with an almost supernatural grace. One could feel the hull lift slightly, gaining speed, cutting through the waves with minimal resistance. In such moments, Lysander understood why some men spent their entire careers in the Navy. The first exercise of the morning involved practicing quick stops and starts. It was these sudden changes in movement that could decide the outcome of a real battle, separating victory from defeat. "Oars," commanded the Caleusts, and immediately all the rowers lifted their blades from the water, holding them horizontally. The ship continued to glide forward by inertia, but without the pull of the oars, it began to slow down. "Back," followed the next command, and now all oars entered the water again, but pulled in the opposite direction. This was one of the most physically grueling actions a trireme crew was capable of. They were not only working against the ship's inertia, but also fighting the natural resistance of the water. Lysander gritted his teeth and pulled with all his might, feeling the ship tremble as it fought its own momentum. Within seconds, the Salaminia came to a complete stop. A few more moments, and it was actually moving backward. It was an impressive demonstration of what human strength could achieve when properly organized and directed. Between exercises, during short breaks, the rowers conversed quietly among themselves. These conversations were a curious mix of technical work issues, personal news, and speculation about where their next assignment might take them. Someone had heard a rumor that they would be escorting a grain convoy from Egypt. Another guessed they would be participating in a show of force in the waters near Corinth. Lysander found these conversations surprisingly comforting. These men came from all over Attica and beyond. Fishermen, farmers, craftsmen, labourers. Yet naval service had forged a common, unbreakable bond between them. They shared the same daily routines, faced the same physical challenges, and felt the same pride in mastering a complex and vital skill. The diversity of their backgrounds, in fact, subtly strengthened the team. Proclus, for example, thanks to years of fishing experience, possessed deep knowledge of weather conditions. Darren, sitting 2 benches ahead, worked as a carpenter before joining the Navy and had valuable insights into wood and its maintenance. Hippus, on the other hand, grew up on a farm and possessed endurance forged by years of heavy agricultural labour. Around midday, they practiced the most complex manoeuvre in their repertoire, a coordinated attack involving 3 ships working together. The Salaminia and 2 other triremes were to approach an imaginary enemy vessel from different directions, forcing it to choose which threat to respond to, thereby leaving it vulnerable to attack from other directions. Such tactical coordination required not only the skill of individual crews, but also impeccable communication and alignment between the ships themselves. Flag signals, trumpet calls, and precise execution of predetermined movements, everything had to work perfectly. When everything went right, it resembled a meticulously choreographed dance, performed by vessels weighing 40 tons each. When something went wrong, as it did during their second attempt this morning, the ships could come dangerously close to each other. Oars could become entangled, and the entire formation could collapse into confusion. This served as a humbling reminder of how much practice is required to fully master the art of trireme warfare. But they kept working at it, repeating the same maneuver again and again until coordination became second nature. This was the true essence of naval training. It wasn't just about building physical strength and endurance, though those were certainly important, but about developing the kind of automatic, instinctive teamwork that would continue to function even under the conditions of real, deadly combat. By the end of the day, when training concluded and they rowed back to port, Lysander was utterly exhausted. His hands were covered in blisters despite the calluses he had built up over years of rowing. His back and shoulders ached in a way that would likely only worsen before relief came. His throat was parched from the salty spray and the effort of maintaining the rhythmic breathing that heavy rowing demanded. However, he also felt a deep satisfaction from the day's work. The crew had performed well, constantly improving their execution of complex maneuvers. The ship responded beautifully to their efforts, demonstrating once again the remarkable engineering that made trireme warfare possible. And there was something deeply satisfying about being part of a team where each person's contribution was both important and noticeable. As he approached the harbour of Piraeus, Lysander could observe other naval vessels returning after intensive training manoeuvres. The sight of so many triremes moving in coordinated formation was truly unforgettable, a living and powerful demonstration of Athenian naval prowess, which clearly explained how this great city-state managed to establish itself as the undisputed dominant force throughout the Aegean Sea. Tonight, his path led home, to a modest dwelling right by the harbour, where dinner with his wife and young daughter awaited him. There he could finally rest his tired muscles, aching from the day's exertion. Tomorrow he would again step aboard the ship to repeat the entire cycle. It was a life far from the romantic and glamorous picture sung by poets. However, it represented honest work that served an extremely important purpose. It was an existence where a man spent his days being an integral part of a vast machine, assembled from human bodies and wooden oars, where every individual effort merged with the collective, becoming a component of something significantly larger and more powerful than himself. The very naval exercises Lysander had just completed were funded by silver coins that passed through the hands of people like Euclid, a banker skillfully managing his small but thriving money-changing business located in the bustling agora. Right now, on this dynamic Athenian morning, in the heart of the city, he meticulously examined a handful of drachmas that a merchant from Aegina wished to exchange for local currency. And what Euclid saw in these small silver discs told him a whole story about trust, the intricacies of trade and the invisible paths of economic power spreading throughout the ancient world. Euclid was 47 years old, and coins had been central to his life for most of his adult years. His father was a skilled silversmith who taught his son to recognize the purity of precious metals by their weight, hue, and the characteristic sound they made when struck against stone. However, Euclid soon discovered that he was more attracted to the economic opportunities inherent in the metal than to its artistic application. Money fascinated him not just as a tool for buying and selling, but as a complex technology that made the very existence of advanced civilization possible. The coins he examined that morning were crafted with exceptional skill, each bearing the image of a sea turtle, unmistakably indicating their origin, the mint of Aegina. The silver was of high quality, and the weight felt right in his palm. But these were not Athenian drachmas. This meant Euclid had to calculate exchange rates, assess the current demand for foreign silver, and precisely determine what profit he could make while offering his client a fair deal. This operation might seem simple, yet it represented something truly revolutionary in human history. Just a few generations ago, most trade was conducted through barter, a direct exchange of goods for other goods or for measured quantities of precious metal, which had to be weighed and carefully checked for purity in each individual transaction. The development of standardized coinage changed this paradigm completely, making trade faster, significantly more reliable, and more accessible to ordinary people who lacked specialized knowledge in assessing raw silver. Athens was relatively late in adopting coinage. Cities like Aegina and Corinth had been producing their own coins for decades before Athens issued its first official silver drachmas. But when the Athenians finally began minting their own money, they approached the process with their characteristic thoroughness and innovative approach. Soon the Athenian drachma became the most reliable and authoritative currency in the entire Greek world, universally accepted from distant Sicily to the shores of the Black Sea. The reason for such profound trust became evident upon careful examination of an Athenian coin, as Euclid did dozens of times a day. Its silver content was consistently high, almost pure, with minimal copper added to give the coins greater durability. The weight was standardized with astonishing precision, ensured by strict quality control at the mint, and the design was instantly recognizable. One side featured the head of Athena, and the other her sacred owl, complemented by a small olive branch symbolizing the goddess's gift to the city. However, the true innovation of Athenian coinage lay not so much in its technical aspects as in its economic significance. These coins derived their value not only from their silver content, but also from the economic and military might of Athens itself. When a merchant in a remote port accepted an Athenian drachma as payment, he expressed confidence not only in the quality of the metal, but also in the stability and prosperity of the entire Athenian state. It was about this that Euclid often pondered as he went about his daily business. Each coin passing through his hands represented a small but weighty fragment of Athens's reputation, carried by merchants to markets across the Mediterranean. The widespread acceptance of Athenian currency was both a result of the city's success and one of the key factors contributing to that success. His client today was Xenophon, a merchant specializing in importing pottery from various Greek cities and then selling it in the Athenian market. Xenophon had just returned from a long trading journey that had taken him to Aegina, Corinth, and several other smaller cities, and he now had a collection of foreign coins that he needed to convert into Athenian currency. The Aegina turtle coins are good silver, Euclid said, weighing them in his palm. However, the market rate fluctuates due to rumors of political troubles in Aegina. I can offer you 4 Athenian drachmas for every 5 Aeginetan. Xenophon considered the offer while Euclid continued to examine the other foreign coins the merchant had brought. Among them were several Corinthian staters depicting the winged horse Pegasus, the city's symbol. There was also a handful of smaller denominations from cities whose names Euclid certainly recognized but had never visited. There were even a few barbarian imitations, coins, minted by non-Greek peoples who, understanding the value of Greek currency, lacked the technical skill to create convincing copies. The negotiations that followed were friendly yet serious. Both men understood perfectly that exchange rates reflected not only the intrinsic value of the silver, but also the current political and economic conditions that affected the desirability of various currencies. Athenian coins were always in high demand, as Athens was powerful and prosperous. However, the rates of other currencies fluctuated depending on a multitude of factors, from crop reports to rumors of military movements. I will accept your offer for the Aegina coins, Xenophon finally said, but I would like a better rate for the Corinthian staters. Their silver is as pure as yours, and Corinth has been stable lately. Euclid nodded. This was precisely the kind of informed negotiation he enjoyed. Both parties fully understood the factors involved, and the discussion became a form of economic analysis rather than a simple haggle. Fair enough. Corinthian coins do hold their value well. Very well. I'll offer you the same rate as for the Aeginetan. As he counted out the corresponding number of Athenian drachmas, Euclid reflected on the broader implications of what they were doing. This seemingly simple exchange represented just a small part of a vast network of trade relationships that connected Athens to the rest of the Greek world and even beyond. The pottery Xenophon imported enriched Athenian life with beautiful objects and diverse artistic traditions. The Athenian silver he received in return carried Athens' economic influence to distant markets. However, money changing involved more than just foreign currency. A significant portion of Euclid's business came from Athenian citizens who required smaller denominations for daily purchases or who wanted to convert their silver coins into other forms of stored value. A farmer might bring a handful of drachmas from the sale of his olive oil and ask to exchange them for obols, smaller coins much more suitable for buying bread or fish at the market. Or someone might want to do the reverse, consolidating small change into larger denominations that were easier to transport and store. Athens also minted larger silver coins, known as tetradrachms, worth 4 drachmas each, which were preferred for large transactions, such as buying livestock or paying large debts. Each type of transaction required Euclid to quickly calculate current supply and demand, analyzing the profit and cost of obtaining the coins his clients needed. He maintained close relationships with mint officials who could provide fresh coins as needed, with merchants who regularly required foreign currency exchange services, and with other bankers who could help when he needed currencies not easily available in Athens. Around midday, when the agora reached the peak of its activity, Euclid's stall became a true hub of economic activity. A pottery merchant needed Corinthian coins to pay for his next shipment. A ship captain wanted to convert his Athenian silver into currencies he would need for a trading voyage to Sicily. A wealthy citizen's slave arrived with a pouch of small coins that his master once consolidated into larger denominations. Each such transaction was relatively small, but together they formed the circulatory system of the ancient economy, a continuous flow of money that made specialization, trade, and urban life itself possible. Without a stable currency and the vital services provided by Euclid, Athens's multifaceted economic system could not function fully. Farmers would face insurmountable difficulties trying to easily sell their surplus crops for silver coins, which could then be used to purchase manufactured goods. Craftsmen, in turn, would be unable to fully dedicate themselves to their specialized occupations, constantly worrying about finding buyers who needed their specific products and who possessed exactly what the craftsman required in exchange. In the afternoon, Euclid faces a task that goes beyond his daily activities. A delegation from a small city in Asia Minor has approached Athens requesting financial support for a large public works project. They seek a significant loan in silver, offering their city's future tax revenues as collateral. Such international lending was certainly not within the scope of Euclid's usual operations, but he had extensive connections among bankers who specialized in precisely these large-scale deals. The ensuing meeting vividly demonstrates another dimension of Athens's pervasive economic influence. The city's immense wealth and unwavering stability made Athenian silver extremely desirable, not only as a medium of exchange but also as powerful capital for investment in distant ventures. Thus, the modernization of a harbor in Asia Minor, financed by Athenian loans, would significantly enhance its utility for Athenian merchants. Similarly, a temple construction project, undertaken with Athenian silver, would inevitably create demand for talented Athenian architects and sculptors. It is in this way that economic power constantly strengthens and multiplies itself. Success, like fertile soil, creates countless opportunities for further achievements. Wealth generates even more wealth, and influence steadily spreads through the complex networks of trade and finance that connect the most distant corners of the world to the central hub of prosperity. By evening, as Euclid closed his stall and meticulously put away his accumulated stock of coins in a secure strongbox, he had completed a day in which he had handled silver from a dozen different cities and concluded deals intended to foster trade relations extending hundreds of miles. Tomorrow would undoubtedly bring similar challenges and new opportunities, as the great machine of ancient commerce tirelessly continued its daily work. But this evening, walking home through the peaceful streets of Athens, Euclid carried a profound understanding of how money had fundamentally changed human civilization. These modest silver discs and his sturdy strongbox represented something far greater than merely their weight in precious metal. They served as an embodiment of trust, facilitated cooperation between complete strangers, and made possible the complex society that surrounded him. He must have often wondered what it was like to manage, day in and day out, the very symbols that inextricably bind an entire civilization together, knowing that his labor helped weave the invisible threads of trust and exchange that make urban life even possible. The very silver coins Euclid just carefully put away will tomorrow help fund something that cannot be measured in drachmas or weighed on scales. We are talking about the great dramatic festivals that transform Athens into a grand stage where gods and heroes walk among mortals, and ordinary citizens witness the deepest truths about human nature. Tonight, as the sun slowly set behind the Acropolis, a man named Sophocles, in his modest home near the theatre district, was putting the final touches on a masque for a tragedy set to premiere next month by the light of an oil lamp. This Sophocles is not the celebrated playwright, but a skilled mask maker who bears the name of the great poet, and for 15 years he has dedicated himself to creating the expressive faces worn by actors. His workshop was filled with the tools of his trade: chisels for intricate wood carving, fine brushes for applying paint, strong leather straps for securing masks to actors' heads, and dozens of finished masks hanging on wooden pegs, like a silent gallery of frozen emotions. Each mask was not only a work of art, but also an engineering marvel, designed to perform several key functions simultaneously. It had to be light enough for an actor to wear comfortably for hours, yet sturdy enough to withstand the physical demands of an intense performance. Additionally, the mask had to amplify the actor's voice, ensuring clear audibility for audiences even in the farthest rows, while conveying specific emotions through exaggerated but easily recognizable facial expression. This evening, Sophocles was intently working on a mask intended for the protagonist of Aeschylus's new tragedy, a play recounting the return of King Agamemnon from the destructive Trojan War and the terrible vengeance that awaited him at home. The mask had to convey the full complexity of this character, who was at once heroic and doomed, noble and fatally flawed, a great king who, nevertheless, remained a man blindly walking towards his own demise. The face he carved was larger than life, yet undeniably human. The wide, piercing eyes spoke both of the foresight of a great leader and the tragic blindness of a man failing to see his approaching fate. The mouth was tightly set in a line that could be interpreted as determination or stubbornness, depending on the skill of the actor who would wear the mask. The brows were deeply furrowed, demonstrating the weight of command and the burden of difficult decisions as he worked. Sophocles often reflected on the strange, almost magical power of theatrical performance. Tomorrow evening, when the play is performed, this wooden face will become more real to the audience than the true face of the actor wearing it. The mask will embody Agamemnon so completely that even adult men will shed tears at his fall, though they are perfectly aware that they are watching their neighbor, who works as a carpenter by day, perform. It is this transformation that lies at the heart of what makes Athenian theatre so extraordinary. In a matter of hours, an ordinary hillside amphitheatre transforms into Troy, Thebes, or the palace of Mycenae. Citizens who spend their days farming, trading, or potting witness events that occurred centuries ago or never existed at all, except in the boundless imagination of poets. And through this astonishing alchemy of words, masks, music, and movement, they discover truths about themselves and their world that cannot be grasped in any other way. Theatrical festivals hold one of the most important places in the Athenian calendar, rivaling even the great religious festivals in their significance for society. The festival of Dionysus, held every spring, brings together citizens of all social strata for 4 days of captivating dramatic competitions. Wealthy citizens compete for the honor of sponsoring productions, playwrights vie for prestigious prizes and glory, and actors strive to win the recognition of their fellow citizens. However, the true competition unfolds between different understandings of what it means to be human. Each tragedy deeply explores the relationships between mortals and gods, between fate and free will, between individual desire and social responsibility. Each comedy, like a mirror, is held up to contemporary society, revealing its absurdities and contradictions with satirical precision. And each satyr play provides the necessary release of tension through crude humor and physical comedy. Sophocles had been part of this world long enough to realize that theatrical masks served a far deeper purpose than mere disguise. The stylized, exaggerated features of tragic masks did not simply help actors portray specific characters. They transformed human faces into archetypal representations of universal emotions and experiences. Love, rage, grief, joy, fear all become larger than life, more intense and purer than they ever manifest in ordinary existence. This afternoon he was visited by Callipides, one of the city's most respected tragic actors. Callipides came to discuss the masks he would wear in the upcoming production, especially the technical difficulties of playing multiple roles in a single performance. The actor explained that the transition from Agamemnon to the messenger had to happen extremely quickly, yet the emotional shift was enormous. One moment he portrays a king returning in triumph, and the next he becomes a messenger bringing news of disaster. The masks, in his opinion, had to fully support this complex transformation. It is this kind of practical problem that makes Sophocles' work both challenging and incredibly fascinating. Actors in Greek theatre traditionally play multiple roles, changing masks and costumes behind a temporary screen while the chorus fills the pause with a performance. Consequently, masks must be designed not only for the individual effectiveness of each image, but also for the cumulative impact of the entire performance. The workshop where Sophocles creates his masks is located just a few hundred yards from the theatre itself, close enough for him to regularly attend rehearsals and observe how his creations perform in real stage conditions. The Theatre of Dionysus, carved into the southern slope of the Acropolis, masterfully utilizes the natural acoustics created by the hillside amphitheatre. During the day, when no performances are scheduled, the theatre is a peaceful place where citizens sometimes come to reflect or converse quietly. However, during festival season, it transforms into the beating heart of Athenian cultural life. Up to 15,000 people can gather there, almost a third of the city's entire population, to share the unforgettable experience of great drama. The economics of theatrical production are as complex as its artistic challenges. Each play requires significant financial investment, including payments to the playwright, actors and chorus members, as well as costs for costumes, masks, and stage equipment. In addition, substantial expenses go into creating the elaborate sets required for some productions. Wealthy citizens who act as sponsors compete not only for artistic glory, but also for the political benefits that successful public service brings. This system of private sponsorship makes possible theatrical productions of extraordinary complexity and scale. A single tragedy can involve 15 chorus members, 3 principal actors, and numerous extras, all costumed and equipped to the highest artistic standards. The sponsor who covers all these expenses receives public recognition and gratitude, but also demonstrates their deep commitment to the cultural values that underpin Athenian civilization. As dusk settles over the city and the light in his workshop gradually fades, Sophocles meticulously inspects the fruits of his day's labor. The mask of Agamemnon, majestic and formidable, is almost complete. The delicate carving is finished, and tomorrow he will begin the painstaking process of painting and finishing, a stage that will breathe true life into the character's image. The choice of color palette must be not only accurate but strategic. The shades are intended not only to convey the hero's deep essence, but also to be clearly discernible even from the farthest rows of the vast theatre. Traditionally, tragic masks are created using a limited set of colors, each carrying deep symbolic meaning. Thus, a rich red is traditionally associated with passion or an act of violence. Pure white indicates innocence or divine origin, and deep black symbolizes death or the underworld. An experienced mask maker, skillfully wielding this limited arsenal, combines these colors in subtle nuances that enhance the emotional impact of the performance, while avoiding excessive complexity that could overwhelm the audience's perception. However, color is only one facet of the multifaceted expressive power possessed by a theatrical mask. The shape of the mouth, the angle of the eyebrows, and the harmonious proportions of all facial features, each of these elements collectively creates an image capable of conveying the most complex human emotions, even at a significant distance from the stage. For example, a barely perceptible upward curve at the corners of the mouth can eloquently suggest some hidden knowledge or the bitter irony of fate. An eye's positioned slightly off-center can convey a sense of inner turmoil or deep divided loyalty. Tonight, having finished work on Agamemnon's mask, Sophocles will join his neighbors for a modest dinner, perhaps accompanied by 1 or 2 cups of wine. The conversation, as is often the case in their circle, will likely turn to the upcoming festival, to speculations about which of the presented plays will win the coveted prizes in the competitions. For in Athens, every citizen has their own, often very firm, opinion on drama, and theatrical festivals invariably generate lively discussions that sometimes do not subside for many months after the last performances have ended. Such comprehensive involvement in theatrical art is a vivid reflection of unique Athenian culture. While in many other societies artistic performance often remains the domain of a narrow group of professionals, appreciated only by those who can afford to attend, and largely irrelevant to the lives of ordinary citizens in Athens, drama holds a truly central place in civic life. It is an integral part of how the community understands itself and its place in the wider world. The stories enacted on stage draw their power from the common cultural knowledge possessed by every citizen. References to Homer's epic poems, to local history, to deep religious beliefs, and to established customs, all create a multi-layered palette of meanings that enriches the dramatic experience for audiences who bring a complex and profound cultural literacy to their role as observers. Tomorrow, Sophocles will continue his work on masks intended for other key characters in the Agamemnon trilogy. These include Clytemnestra, the queen whose once ardent love turned into deadly hatred, Cassandra, the prophetic princess whose warnings, alas, are destined never to be heard, and Aegisthus, the lover whose weakness makes him merely a tool in the hands of stronger wills. Each of them will require a special approach, a subtle balance between realism and stylization. But tonight, preparing for sleep, Sophocles reflects on the extraordinary privilege bestowed upon his craft. Through his mastery of wood, paint and bronze, he helps create faces through which poets address their fellow citizens with the deepest questions of human existence. His masks transform into a powerful means through which ordinary people encounter extraordinary truths. What must it be like to spend your days creating visages that allow stories to transcend the boundaries between past and present, between myth and reality, between individual imagination and the collective soul of an entire community? The powerful dramas that Sophocles, through his artistry, helps to bring into visible form through masks, will not only be seen, but also deeply understood by future generations of Athenians. And this will happen largely thanks to the patient labour of people like Diodorus, the grammarian, who dedicates his days to teaching reading, writing, and the basics of mathematics. He spends hours in a small schoolroom near the agora, helping young boys master the fundamental skills that will, in the future, make them educated and fully fledged citizens of the polis. Diodorus was 51 years old and had dedicated nearly 3 decades of his life to teaching. His hair was now silvered with noble grey, and his back was slightly stooped from many years spent leaning over students' work. His voice had acquired a special, recognizable quality, forged by constant interaction with groups of children and adolescents. However, his enthusiasm for teaching remained as fervent and unwavering as it was at the very beginning of his pedagogical journey, and he still experienced genuine joy when a student who had long struggled finally fully grasped a complex concept. This morning he is working with a group of 12 boys aged 7 to 14, whose families are wealthy enough to provide their sons with a formal education. The classroom setting is extremely simple. There are only wooden benches, a few tables, shelves lined with papyrus scrolls, and wooden tablets covered with a layer of wax, and nothing more. The true equipment for learning, Diodorus believes, lies not in material objects, but in the inquisitive minds of the students and the profound knowledge of their mentor. The youngest student in this class is Nicus, whose father owns several olive groves and wishes for his son to master reading and writing sufficiently for business correspondence. At 7 years old, Nicias is just beginning to learn the basics of literacy, working with a wooden tablet covered with a layer of wax, where he can practice forming symbols with a bronze stylus. Mastering writing skills in ancient Greek proves significantly more challenging than one might assume. The alphabet itself is relatively new, only a few generations old, and spelling rules have not yet been fully standardized. What further complicates the task is the absence of spaces between words, punctuation marks, and capital letters in written Greek. They are used only at the beginning of important text sections. For example, a sentence might look something like this: "People who ignore history are doomed to rep it." Reading such text requires not just recognizing individual letters, but also the ability to mentally separate words, identify grammatical structures, and mentally insert punctuation that makes the meaning clear and accessible. This is a skill that takes many years of diligent work to fully develop, and even educated adults sometimes struggle with particularly complex passages. Diodorus begins each school day with declamation exercises. The boys stand and recite in unison, in chorus, passages from Homer, which every educated Greek must know by heart. Today they are honing lines from the Iliad, the section where Achilles finally returns to battle, to avenge the death of his loyal friend Patroclus. Sing, goddess, the wrath of Achilles, son of Peleus, that wrath which brought countless woes upon the Achaeans. The rhythmic structure of the verses helps the boys memorize not only the words themselves, but also the complex grammatical constructions and rich vocabulary that will later serve as models for their own speech and writing. Homer's language is, of course, more complex and elevated than everyday speech, but it represents a standard of excellence that educated men must strive to master. Following declamation is writing practice. The older boys diligently copy passages from various authors, including not only Homer, but also Hesiod, Solon, and other prominent poets whose works form the unshakable foundation of Greek literary culture. The very act of copying forces them to pay close attention to spelling, grammar, and style, and also develops the hand strength and coordination necessary for fluid and elegant writing. Meanwhile, younger students like Nicias focus on simpler exercises. They practice writing individual letters, learn to recognize common word patterns, and grapple with the challenging task of separating continuous text into meaningful units. Diodorus constantly moves between the different groups, offering support, correcting errors, and providing individualized guidance as needed. Around mid-morning, the lesson transitions to mathematics. Greek mathematics, unlike purely theoretical mathematics, has a distinctly practical focus, concentrating on arithmetic and geometric skills necessary for citizens to conduct business, build, measure land, and a multitude of other everyday applications. The boys learn addition and subtraction, multiplication and division, how to work with fractions, and solve simple word problems. The mathematics curriculum also includes basic geometry, particularly the relationships between different shapes and the calculations needed to measure areas and volumes. This knowledge will prove invaluable whether the boys grow up to be farmers who need to calculate yields from irregularly shaped fields, merchants who tally profits and losses, or craftsmen who determine how much material they will need for various projects. One of the more advanced students, 15-year-old Cleomenes, is currently engrossed in a problem that requires him to calculate the amount of olive oil that can be stored in cylindrical jars of various sizes. This is precisely the kind of practical math that will be needed in his father's shipping business. But this problem also clearly demonstrates the geometric principles underlying more complex mathematical thinking. Remember, Diodorus instructs him, the volume of a cylinder is the area of the base multiplied by the height, and the area of a circle is the radius squared multiplied by pi. But since we don't have an absolutely precise value for pi, we use an approximation that best suits our practical purposes. This harmonious blend of theoretical understanding and practical application is characteristic of Athenian education at its best. Students learn foundational principles that will serve them in a wide variety of life contexts, but these principles are always closely tied to real-world applications that clearly demonstrate their usefulness. The daily lesson concluded with what modern educators might metaphorically call current events. It involved a detailed discussion of recent political changes, the progress of military campaigns, significant legal proceedings, and other matters whose understanding was vital for any informed citizen. Diodorus, the teacher, read aloud official announcements posted in the agora and meticulously explained the necessary context to grasp the essence of current issues. That day, the central topic was the consideration of a proposed bill according to which all imported grain had to be sold exclusively through state channels, with prices set by magistrates rather than being formed through free negotiation between buyers and sellers. This presented an extremely complex issue, deeply intertwined with economics, politics, the legal system, and social policy. It was precisely such multifaceted challenges that required citizens of a democratic society to possess the capacity for deep and thoughtful analysis. The boys, Diodorus's students, asked questions that simultaneously demonstrated their developing understanding and, at the same time, lingering confusion about how the Athenian government functioned. For example, they were interested in how exactly are magistrates elected? What would happen if merchants refused to accept the officially set prices? And why does Athens even need to import grain if there are numerous farms around the city? Each of these questions became a starting point for explanations that connected the immediate problem with broader patterns and structures of Athenian society. The grain law, it turned out, partly concerned issues of food security, partly the management of relationships with trading partners, and partly the need to balance the interests of various social strata within the city. Understanding it required extensive knowledge of geography, economics, political theory, and social history. It was precisely this integrative or holistic thinking that was one of the fundamental skills the Athenian education system sought to foster and develop. Instead of presenting different academic disciplines as completely separate spheres of knowledge, skilled teachers helped their charges discover the interconnections between diverse aspects of learning and life itself, forming a unified worldview. As the school day drew to a close, Diodorus assigned homework designed to reinforce the day's lessons. Younger boys were to practice writing letters and simple words, honing their calligraphy and basic literacy skills. The middle group was tasked with rewriting a passage from Hesiod and preparing to discuss its meaning the next day. Older students read a speech by Solon and wrote a short essay analyzing his arguments regarding justice and law. These assignments were more than simple academic exercises. They served as preparation for active citizenship in a society where full political participation required the ability to understand complex discussions, critically evaluate competing claims, and clearly and, most importantly, persuasively articulate one's own positions. After the boys had gone home, Diodorus devoted time to preparing for tomorrow's lessons, carefully reviewing students' completed work and considering how to help each boy overcome his individual learning difficulties. For example, Nicias was successfully mastering the basics of writing, but struggled significantly with mathematics. Cleomenes, on the other hand, showed brilliant aptitude for arithmetic, but needed to work diligently on the clarity and precision of his written expression. Such individual attention was undoubtedly one of the undeniable advantages of learning in small classes. However, it also exposed a significant limitation of Athenian schooling. Only sufficiently wealthy families, able to afford private tuition, could provide their sons with the kind of education Diodorus offered. Poorer families were forced to send their boys to less expensive schools with larger classes and consequently more limited curricula. Or they might forgo formal education for their children altogether. The result of this situation was a society with deep educational inequalities, which directly translated into political and economic disparities. Men who would become leaders in law, politics, military affairs, and business disproportionately came from families able to provide their children with the best education. Yet, within the constraints of this system, teachers like Diodorus provided something truly invaluable, not only literacy and numeracy, but also broad cultural knowledge and critical thinking skills that made democratic citizenship possible. His students grew into men who would participate in political debates in the assembly, serve on juries, hold public office, and make countless individual decisions that would shape the course of Athenian history. This evening, walking home through the quiet streets of Athens, Diodorus reflected on the unique responsibility of his profession. The boys who sat in his classroom today would tomorrow become citizens who would shape the future of Athens. The skills they learned, the habits of thought they developed, the cultural knowledge they acquired, all would influence decisions affecting thousands of lives and perhaps determine whether Athenian democracy survived and prospered. It was an enormous responsibility for a simple schoolteacher, but also a source of deep satisfaction. Through patient daily work with each student, he helped maintain the intellectual traditions that made Athenian civilization possible. The boys who struggled with letters today might grow into statesmen, generals, poets, and philosophers who define the very essence of Greek identity. He understood what it must be like to spend his days planting seeds of knowledge in young minds, with the understanding that some of those seeds might eventually blossom into ideas that could change the world, while others might simply help individuals live more thoughtful, more fulfilling lives.